Welcome back to our riveting journey through American Prometheus. In this episode, we delve deeper into Part 1, Chapter 4, as we continue to explore the remarkable life and legacy of our American icon. Part 1 has taken us through the early years and pivotal moments, but now we're about to uncover more of the dramatic twists and turns in their extraordinary journey. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any part of this captivating narrative. Without further ado, let's dive into the pages of American Prometheus and uncover the next chapter in this remarkable story.
Chapter 4. I find the work hard, thank God, and amp almost pleasant. You would like Göttingen, I think. The science is much better than at Cambridge, and amp, on the whole, probably the best to be found. I find the work hard, thank God, and amp almost pleasant. Robert Oppenheimer, to Francis Ferguson, November 14th, 1926. Late in the summer of 1926, Robert, in far better spirits and considerably more mature than a year earlier, traveled by train through Lower Saxony to Göttingen, a small medieval town that boasted a city hall and several churches dating back to the 14th century. At the corner of Barfüßerstraße and Judenstraße, Barefoot Street and Street of the Jews, he could dine on Wiener Schnitzel at the 400-year-old Junkers Hall, sitting beneath a steel engraving of Otto von Bismarck and surrounded by 3 stories of stained glass. Quaint, half-timbered houses were scattered about the town's narrow, winding streets. Nestled on the banks of the Line Canal, Göttingen had as its chief attraction Georgia Augusta University, founded in the 1730s by a German prince. By tradition, graduates of the university were expected to wade into a fountain that stood before the ancient city hall and kiss the Goose Girl, a bronze maiden that served as the fountain's centerpiece. If Cambridge could claim to be Europe's great center for experimental physics, Göttingen was undoubtedly the center of theoretical physics. German physicists at the time thought so little of their American counterparts that copies of Physical Review, the monthly research journal of the American Physical Society, routinely sat unread for more than a year before the university librarian got around to putting them on the shelf. It was Oppenheimer's good fortune to arrive shortly before an extraordinary revolution in theoretical physics drew to its close: Max Planck's discovery of quanta, photons; Einstein's magnificent achievement, the special theory of relativity; Niels Bohr's description of the hydrogen atom; Werner Heisenberg's formulation of matrix mechanics; and Erwin Schrödinger's theory of wave mechanics. This truly innovative period began to wind down with Born's 1926 paper on probability and causality. It was completed in 1927 with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and Bohr's formulation of the theory of complementarity. By the time Robert left Göttingen, the foundations for a post-Newtonian physics had been laid. As chairman of the physics department, Professor Max Born nurtured the work of Heisenberg, Eugene Wigner, Wolfgang Pauli, and Enrico Fermi. It was Born who in 1924 coined the term quantum mechanics, and it was Born who suggested that the outcome of any interaction in the quantum world is determined by chance. In 1954, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. A pacifist and a Jew, Born was regarded by his students as an unusually warm and patient teacher. He was the ideal mentor for a young student with Robert's delicate temperament. That academic year, Oppenheimer would find himself in the company of an extraordinary collection of scientists. James Franck, with whom Robert was also studying, was an experimental physicist who had won the Nobel Prize just a year earlier. The German chemist Otto Hahn would in just a few years contribute to the discovery of nuclear fission. Another German physicist, Ernst Pascual Jordan, was collaborating with Born and Heisenberg to formulate the matrix mechanics version of quantum theory. The young English physicist Paul Dirac, whom Oppenheimer had met at Cambridge, was then working on early quantum field theory. And in 1933, he would share a Nobel Prize with Erwin Schrödinger. The Hungarian-born mathematician John von Neumann would later work for Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project. George Eugene Uhlenbeck was an Indonesian-born Dutchman who, together with Samuel Abraham Goudsmit, discovered the concept of electron spin in late 1925. Robert quickly drew the attention of these men. He had met Uhlenbeck the previous spring during his week-long visit to the University of Leiden. "We got along very well immediately," recalled Uhlenbeck. Robert was so deeply immersed in physics that it seemed to Uhlenbeck as if we were old friends. Robert found lodging in a private villa owned by a Göttingen physician who had lost his medical license for malpractice. Once very well-to-do, the Cario family now had a spacious granite villa with a walled garden of several acres near the center of Göttingen, and no money. With the family's fortune eaten away by Germany's post-war inflation, they were compelled to take on boarders. Fluent in German, Robert quickly grasped the debilitating political atmosphere of the Weimar Republic. He later speculated that the Carios had the typical bitterness on which the Nazi movement rested. That autumn, he wrote his brother that everyone seemed concerned with trying to make Germany a practically successful and amp-sane country. Neuroticism is severely frowned upon. So are Jews, Prussians, and AMPAP French. Outside the university's gate, Robert could see that times were tough for most Germans. Although this university society was extremely rich and warm and helpful to me, it was parked there in a very miserable German mood. He found many Germans bitter, sullen, angry, and loaded with all those ingredients which were later to produce a major disaster. And this I felt very much. He had one German friend, a member of the wealthy Ullstein publishing family, who owned a car. He and Robert used to take long drives in the countryside together. But Oppenheimer was struck by the fact that his friend parked this car in a barn outside Göttingen because he thought it was dangerous to be seen driving it. Life for the American expatriates, and especially for Robert, was quite a different matter. For one thing, he was never short of money. At 22, he dressed casually in rumpled herringbone suits made of the finest English wool. His fellow students noted that, in contrast to their own cloth luggage, Oppenheimer packed his belongings in gleaming, expensive pigskin suitcases. And when they strolled down to the 15th century Zum Schwarzen Bären, the Black Bear pub, to drink Frisch's beer or to sip coffee at the Kron and Amp, Conlan's coffee shop, it was often Robert who picked up the tab. He was transformed. He was now confident, excited, and focused. Material possessions were unimportant to him, but the admiration of others was something he sought every day. To that end, he would use his wit, his erudition, and his fine things to attract those people he wanted within his orbit of admirers. He was, said Uhlenbeck, so to say, clearly a center of all the younger students. He was a kind of oracle. He knew very much, He was very difficult to understand, but very quick. Uhlenbeck thought it remarkable that so young a man already had a whole group of admirers trailing around after him. In contrast to Cambridge, at Göttingen, Oppenheimer felt a pleasant camaraderie with his fellow students. I was part of a little community of people who had some common interests and tastes, and many common interests in physics. At Harvard and Cambridge, Robert's intellectual pursuits had been solitary forays into books. At Göttingen, for the first time, he realized that he could learn from others. Something which, for me, more than most people, is important, began to take place. Namely, I began to have some conversations. Gradually, I guess, they gave me some sense, and, perhaps more, some taste in physics. Something that I probably would not have ever gotten to if I'd been locked up in a room. Lodging with him in the Cario family villa was Carl T. Compton, age 39, a professor of physics at Princeton University. Compton, a future president of MIT, felt intimidated by Oppenheimer's extraordinary versatility. He could hold his own with the young man when the topic was science, but found himself at a loss when Robert began talking about literature, philosophy, or even politics. No doubt with Compton in mind, Robert wrote his brother that most of the other American expatriates in Göttingen were professors at Princeton or California or some such place, married, respectable. They are mostly pretty good at physics, but completely uneducated and unspoiled. They envy the Germans for their intellectual adroitness and organization and want physics to come to America. In short, Robert thrived in Göttingen. That autumn, he wrote enthusiastically to Francis Ferguson, "You would like Göttingen, I think. Like Cambridge, it is almost exclusively scientific and Such philosophers as are here are pretty largely interested in epistemological paradoxes and tricks. The science is much better than at Cambridge and on the whole, probably the best to be found. They are working very hard here and combining a fantastically impregnable metaphysical disingenuousness with the go-getting habits of a wallpaper manufacturer. The result is that the work done here has an almost demoniac lack of plausibility to it, and is highly successful. I find the work hard, thank God, and almost pleasant. Most of the time, he felt himself on an even keel emotionally. But there were some momentary relapses. One day, Paul Dirac saw him faint and fall to the floor, just as he had done the previous year in Rutherford's laboratory. I still was not entirely well, Oppenheimer recalled decades later, and I had several attacks during the year, but they became much more isolated and interfered less and less with work. Another physics student, Thorfinn Hognes, and his wife Phoebe, also roomed that year in the Cario mansion and found Oppenheimer's behavior sometimes odd. Phoebe often saw him lying in bed, doing nothing. But then these periods of hibernation were invariably followed by episodes of incessant talking. Phoebe thought him highly neurotic. On occasion, some witnessed Robert trying to overcome an episode of stuttering. Gradually, with his self-assurance returning, Oppenheimer found that his reputation had preceded him. One of his last acts before leaving Cambridge had been to present 2 papers before the Cambridge Philosophical Society, titled On the Quantum Theory of Vibration Rotation Bands and the Quantum Theory of the Problem of the Two Bodies. The first paper dealt with molecular energy levels, and the second investigated transitions continuum states in hydrogenic atoms. Both papers represented small but important advances in quantum theory. And Oppenheimer was pleased to learn that the Cambridge Philosophical Society had published them by the time he arrived in Göttingen. Robert responded to the recognition his publications brought him by throwing himself enthusiastically into seminar discussions with such abandon that he often annoyed his fellow students. He was a man of great talent. Professor Max Born later wrote that he was conscious of his superiority in a way that was embarrassing and led to trouble. In Born's seminar on quantum mechanics, Robert routinely interrupted whoever was speaking, not excluding Born, and, stepping to the blackboard with chalk in hand, would declare in his American-accented German, "This can be done much better in the following manner." Though other students complained about these interruptions, Robert was oblivious to his professor's polite, half-hearted attempts to change his behavior. One day, however, Maria Goeppert, a future Nobelist, presented Born with a petition written on thick parchment and signed by her and most of the other members of the seminar. Unless the child prodigy was reined in, his fellow students would boycott the class. Still unwilling to confront Oppenheimer, Born decided to leave the document on his desk in a place where Robert could not help but see it when he next came to discuss his thesis. To make this more certain, Born later wrote, "I arranged to be called out of the room for a few minutes. This plot worked. When I returned, I found him rather pale and not so voluble as usual. Thereafter, his interruptions ceased altogether. Not that he was by any means completely tamed. Robert could startle even his professors with his bruising candor. Born was a brilliant theoretical physicist, but because he sometimes made small mistakes in his long calculations, he often asked a graduate student to recheck his math. On one occasion, Born recalled, he gave a set of calculations to Oppenheimer. After a few days, Robert returned and said, "I couldn't find any mistake. Did you do this alone?" All of Born's students knew of his propensity for calculation errors, but, as Born later wrote, Oppenheimer was the only one frank and rude enough to say it without joking. I was not offended. It increased my esteem for his remarkable personality. Born soon began collaborating with Oppenheimer, who wrote one of his Harvard physics professor, Edwin Kemble, a veritable summary of their work. Almost all of the theorists seem to be working on Q-mechanics. Professor Born is publishing a paper on the adiabatic theorem, and AMPA Heisenberg on Schwankungen fluctuations. Perhaps the most important idea is one of Wolfgang Pauli, suggests that the usual Schrödinger psi functions are only special cases, and only in special cases, the spectroscopic one, give the physical information we want. I have been working for some time on the quantum theory of a periodic phenomena. Another problem with Professor Born and I are working is the law of deflection of, say, a particle by a nucleus. We have not made very much progress with this, but I think we shall soon have it. Certainly, the theory will not be so simple when it is done as the old one based on corpuscular dynamics. Professor Kemble was impressed. After less than 3 months in Göttingen, his former student seemed steeped in the excitement of unraveling the mysteries of quantum mechanics. By February 1927, Robert felt so confident of his mastery of the new quantum mechanics that he was writing his Harvard physics professor, Percy Bridgman, to explain its finer points. In the classical quantum theory, an electron in one of two regions of low potential, which were separated by a region of high potential, could not cross to the other without receiving enough energy to clear impediments. On the new theory that is no longer true, the electron will spend part of its time in one region and amp part in the other. On one point, the new mechanics suggest a change, however. The electrons, which are free in the sense defined above, are not free in the sense that they are carriers of equipartition thermal energy. To account for the Wiedemann-Franz law, one might have to adopt the suggestion, due, I think, to Professor Bohr, that when an electron jumps from one atom to another, the two atoms may exchange momentum. With best greetings, yours, J.R. Oppenheimer Bridgman was no doubt impressed by his former student's command of the new theory, but Robert's lack of tact made others leery. He could be engaging and considerate one moment, and in the next, rudely cut someone off. At the dinner table, he was polite and formal to an extreme, but he seemed incapable of tolerating banalities. The trouble is that Oppie is so quick on the trigger intellectually, complained one of his fellow students, Edward U. Condon, that he puts the other guy at a disadvantage. And damn it, he is always right, or at least right enough. Having just earned his PhD from Berkeley in 1926, Condon was struggling to support a wife and an infant child on a small postdoctoral fellowship. It annoyed him that Oppenheimer spent money so casually on food and fine clothes, while seeming blissfully unaware of his friend's familial responsibilities. One day, Robert invited Ed and Emily Condon out for a walk, but Emily explained that she had to stay with the baby. The Condons were startled when Robert replied, "All right, we'll leave you to your peasant tasks." And yet, despite his occasional cutting remarks, Robert often displayed a sense of humor. Upon seeing Carl Compton's 2-year-old daughter pretending to read a small red book, which just happened to be on the topic of birth control, Robert looked over at the very pregnant Mrs. Compton and quipped, "A little late." Paul Dirac arrived in Göttingen for the winter term of 1927, and he too rented a room in the Cario Villa. Robert relished any contact with Dirac. "The most exciting time in my life," Oppenheimer once said, "was when Dirac arrived and gave me the proofs of his paper on the quantum theory of radiation." The young English physicist was perplexed, however, by his friend's determined intellectual versatility. "They tell me you write poetry as well as working at physics," Dirac said to Oppenheimer. "How can you do both?" In physics, we try to tell people in such a way that they understand something that nobody knew before. In the case of poetry, it's the exact opposite. Flattered, Robert just laughed. He knew that for Dirac, life was physics and nothing else. By contrast, his interests were extravagantly Catholic. He still loved French literature, and while in Göttingen, he found time to read Paul Claudel's dramatic comedy, Jeune fille violaine, F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story collections, The Sensible Thing and Winter Dreams, Anton Chekhov's play Ivanov, and the works of Johann Hölderlin and Stefan Zweig. When he discovered that two friends were regularly reading Dante in the original Italian, Robert disappeared from Göttingen's cafes for a month and returned with enough Italian to read Dante aloud. Dirac was unimpressed, grumbling, "Why do you waste time on such trash? And I think you're giving too much time to music and that painting collection of yours." But Robert lived comfortably in worlds beyond Dirac's comprehension, and so was merely amused by his friend's urgings during their long walks around Göttingen to abandon the pursuit of the irrational. Göttingen was not all physics and poetry. Robert also found himself attracted to Charlotte Riefenstahl, a German physics student and one of the prettiest women on campus. They had met on a student overnight trip to Hamburg. Riefenstahl was standing on the train platform when she glanced down at the assembled luggage, and her eyes were drawn to the one suitcase not made from cheap cardboard or worn brown leather. "What a beautiful thing," she said to Professor Frank, pointing to the shiny tan leather pigskin grip. "Whose is it?" "Who else but Oppenheimer's," said Frank with a shrug. On the train ride back to Göttingen, Riefenstahl asked someone to point out Oppenheimer, and when she sat down beside him, he was reading a novel by André Gide, the contemporary French novelist whose works dwelt on the individual's moral responsibility for the affairs of the world. To his astonishment, he discovered that this pretty woman had read Gide and could intelligently discuss his work. Upon arriving in Göttingen, Charlotte casually mentioned how much she admired his pigskin bag. Robert acknowledged the compliment, but seemed perplexed that anyone would bother to admire his luggage. When Riefenstahl later recounted the conversation to a fellow student, he predicted that Robert would soon try to give her the bag. Among his many eccentricities, everyone knew that Robert felt compelled to give away any possession of his that was admired. Robert was smitten with Charlotte and courted her as best as he could in his stiff, excessively polite manner. So too did one of Robert's classmates, Friedrich Georg Houtermans, a young physicist who had made a name for himself with a paper on the energy production of stars. Like Oppenheimer, Fritz, or Fizzle to some of his friends, had come to Göttingen with a family trust fund. He was the son of a Dutch banker, and his mother was German and half Jewish, a fact that Houtermans was unafraid to advertise. Contemptuous of authority and armed with a dangerous wit, Houtermans liked to tell his Gentile friends, "When your ancestors were still living in the trees, mine were already forging checks." As a teenager growing up in Vienna, he had been expelled from his gymnasium, high school, for publicly reading the Communist Manifesto on May Day. He and Oppenheimer were virtual contemporaries, and both would receive their doctorates in 1927. They shared a passion for literature, and Charlotte. As fate would have it, Oppenheimer and Houtermans would later both work on developing an atomic bomb, but Houtermans would do so in Germany. Physicists had been improvising quantum theory for nearly a quarter of a century when suddenly, in the years 1925-27, a series of dramatic breakthroughs made it possible to construct a radical and cohesive theory of quantum mechanics. Discoveries were then made so rapidly that it was hard to keep up with the literature. Great ideas were coming out so fast during that period, Edward Condon recalled, that one got an altogether wrong impression of the normal rate of progress in theoretical physics. One had intellectual indigestion most of the time that year, and it was most discouraging. In the highly competitive race to publish the new findings, more papers on quantum theory were written from Göttingen than from Copenhagen, Cavendish, or anywhere else in the world. Oppenheimer himself published 7 papers out of Göttingen, a phenomenal output for a 23-year-old graduate student. Wolfgang Pauli began to refer to quantum mechanics as Knabenphysik, boys' physics, because because the authors of so many of these papers were so young. In 1926, Heisenberg and Dirac were only 24 years old. Pauli was 26, and Jordan was 23. The new physics was, to be sure, highly controversial. When Max Born sent Albert Einstein a copy of Heisenberg's 1925 paper on matrix mechanics, an intensely mathematical description of the quantum phenomenon, explained somewhat defensively to the great man that it looks very mystical, but is certainly correct and profound. But after reading the paper that autumn, Einstein wrote Paul Ehrenfest that Heisenberg had laid a big quantum egg. In Göttingen, they believe in it. I don't. Ironically, the author of the theory of relativity would forever believe the Knabenphysik is incomplete, if not profoundly flawed. Einstein's doubts were only heightened when in 1927, Heisenberg published his paper on the central role of uncertainty in the quantum world. What he meant was that it is impossible to determine at any given moment both an entity's precise position and its precise momentum. We cannot know, as a matter of principle, the present in all its details. Born agreed and argued that the outcome of any quantum experiment depended on chance. In 1927, Einstein wrote Born, "An inner voice tells me that this is not the true Jacob. The theory accomplishes a lot, but it does not bring us closer to the secrets of the old one. In any case, I am convinced that he does not play dice." Quantum physics was a young man's science. The young physicists, in turn, regarded Einstein's stubborn refusal to embrace the new physics as a sign that his time had passed. A few years down the road, Oppenheimer would visit Einstein in Princeton, and he came away distinctly unimpressed, writing his brother with cocky irreverence that Einstein is completely cuckoo. But in the late 1920s, the boys from Göttingen and Bohr's Copenhagen still had hopes of recruiting Einstein to their quantum vision. The first of Oppenheimer's papers, written at Göttingen, demonstrated that quantum theory made it possible to measure the frequencies and intensities of the molecular band spectrum. He had become obsessed with what he called the miracle of quantum mechanics, precisely because the new theory explained so much about observable phenomena in a harmonious, consistent, and intelligible way. By February 1927, Born was so impressed with Oppenheimer's work on the application of quantum theory to transitions in the continuous spectrum that he found himself writing S.W. Stratton, the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have here several Americans. One man is quite excellent, Mr. Oppenheimer. For sheer brilliance, Robert's peers ranked him with Dirac and Jordan. There are 3 young geniuses in theory here, reported one young American student, each less intelligible to me than the others. Robert got into the habit of working all night and then sleeping through a good part of the day. Göttingen's damp weather and poorly heated buildings wreaked havoc on his delicate constitution. He walked around with a chronic cough, which friends attributed to either his frequent colds or his chain smoking. But in other respects, life in Göttingen was pleasantly bucolic. As Hans Bethe later observed of this golden age in theoretical physics, life at the centers of the development of quantum theory, Copenhagen and Göttingen, was idyllic and leisurely, despite the enormous amount of work accomplished. Oppenheimer invariably sought out those young men with growing reputations. others could not help but feel they had been snubbed. He, Oppenheimer, and Born became very close friends, Edward Condon said rather peevishly years later, and saw a great deal of each other, so much so that Born did not see much of the other theoretical physics students who had come there to work with him. Heisenberg passed through Göttingen that year, and Robert made a point of meeting the brightest of Germany's young physicists. Just 3 years older than Oppenheimer, Heisenberg was articulate, charming, and tenacious in argument with his peers. Both men possessed original intellects and knew it. The son of a professor of Greek, Heisenberg had studied with Wolfgang Pauli at the University of Munich, and later he had done postdoctoral work with both Bohr and Born. Like Oppenheimer, Heisenberg had a way of using his intuition to cut to the root of a problem. He was an oddly charismatic young man whose sparkling intellect commanded attention. By all accounts, Oppenheimer admired Heisenberg and respected his work. He could not have known then that in the years ahead they would become shadowy rivals. Oppenheimer would one day find himself contemplating Heisenberg's loyalty to wartime Germany and wondering whether the man was capable of building an atomic bomb for Adolf Hitler. But in 1927, he was building on Heisenberg's discoveries in quantum mechanics. Robert became interested in using the new quantum theory to explain, as he put it, why molecules were molecules. In very short order, he found a simple solution to the problem when he showed Professor Born his notes. The older man was startled and very pleased. They then agreed to collaborate on a paper, and Robert promised that while he was in Paris for Easter, he would write up his notes into a first draft. But Born was horrified when he received from Paris a very spare 4 or 5 page paper. "I thought that this was about right," Oppenheimer recalled. "It was very light of touch, and it seemed to me all that was necessary." Born eventually lengthened the paper to 30 pages, padding it, Robert thought, with unnecessary or obvious theorems. "I didn't like it, but I couldn't protest to a senior author." For Oppenheimer, the central new idea was everything. The context and the academic window dressing were clutter that disturbed his acute aesthetic sense. The Quantum Theory of Molecules was published later that year. This joint paper containing the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, in reality, just the Oppenheimer approximation, is still regarded as a significant breakthrough in using quantum mechanics to understand the behavior of molecules. Oppenheimer recognized that the lighter electrons in molecules travel at a much greater speed than the heavier nuclei. By integrating out the higher frequency electron motions, he and Born were then able to calculate the effective wave mechanical phenomena of nuclear vibrations. The paper laid the foundation for developments more than 7 decades later in high-energy physics. Late that spring, Robert submitted his doctoral thesis, the heart of which contained a complicated calculation for the photoelectric effect in hydrogen and X-rays. Born recommended that it be accepted with distinction. The one fault he noted was that the paper was difficult to read. Nevertheless, Born recorded that Oppenheimer had written a complicated paper, and he did it very well. Years later, Hans Bethe, another Nobel laureate, observed that in 1926, Oppenheimer had to develop all the methods himself, including the normalization of wave functions in the continuum. Naturally, his calculations were later improved upon, but he correctly obtained the absorption coefficient at the K-edge and the frequency dependence in its neighborhood. Bethe concluded, "Even today, this is a complicated calculation, beyond the scope of most quantum mechanics textbooks." On May 11th, 1927, Robert sat down for his oral examination and emerged a few hours later with excellent grades. Afterwards, one of his examiners, the physicist James Franck, told a colleague, "I got out of there just in time. He was beginning to ask me questions." At the last moment, the university's authorities discovered to their indignation that Oppenheimer had failed to register formally as a student, and so they threatened to withhold his degree. He was finally awarded his doctorate only after Born interceded and falsely told the Prussian Ministry of Education that economic circumstances render it impossible for Herr Oppenheimer to remain in Göttingen after the end of the summer term. That June, Professor Edwin Kemble happened to be visiting Göttingen and soon wrote a colleague, "Oppenheimer is turning out to be even more brilliant than we thought when we had him at Harvard. He is turning out new work very rapidly and can hold his own with any of the galaxy of young mathematical physicists here." Curiously, the professor added, "Unfortunately, Born tells me that he has the same difficulty expressing himself clearly in writing which we observed at Harvard." Oppenheimer had long since become an extremely expressive writer, but it was also true that his physics papers were usually brief to the point of being cursory. Kemble thought Robert's command of language was indeed remarkable, but that he became two different people when talking about physics and any other general topic. Born was disheartened to see Oppenheimer depart. "It's all right for you to leave, but I cannot," he told him. "You have left me too much homework." A parting gift from Robert to his mentor was a valuable edition of Lagrange's classic text, Mécanique analytique. Decades later, long after he had been forced to flee Germany, Born wrote Oppenheimer. This book has survived all upheavals: revolution, war, emigration, and return. And I am glad that it is still in my library, for it represents very well your attitude to science, which comprehends it as a part of the general intellectual development in the course of human history. By then, Oppenheimer had long eclipsed Born in notoriety, although not in scientific achievement. Göttingen was the scene of Oppenheimer's first real triumph as a young man coming of age. Becoming a scientist, Oppenheimer later remarked, is like climbing a mountain in a tunnel. You wouldn't know whether you were coming out above the valley or whether you were ever coming out at all. This was particularly so for a young scientist on the cusp of the quantum revolution. More of a witness to this upheaval than a participant, he nevertheless demonstrated that he had the raw intellect and motivation to make physics his life's work. In 9 short months, he had combined real academic success with a renewal of his personality and his sense of worth. The profound emotional inadequacies that only a year before had threatened his very survival had been trumped by serious achievements and the confidence that flowed from them. The world now beckoned.
As we wrap up Chapter 4 of American Prometheus, we've delved deeper into the life and experiences of our American icon. This chapter has revealed more about their remarkable journey, shedding light on the challenges and triumphs they faced. The story continues to unfold, and we invite you to join us for the next chapter as we explore the legacy of this extraordinary individual. To stay updated and not miss a single episode, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for being part of our journey, and we look forward to sharing more of American Prometheus with you in the next installment. Until then, keep the curiosity alive and the pages turning.